Turn to Philippians chapter 4. We're going to be looking at verses 10 to 20. Philippians chapter 4, verses 10 to 20. Now, many of you may know this fall we've been going through a sermon series in the book of Philippians, and we get to nearly to the end of the letter. And we've been talking about the kind of joy that Christianity has to offer that can withstand the test of time and of circumstances. Now, before we go into our verses for today, let me just start us off this way. Many of you may have heard of this thing called the founder myth. Founder myth. Now, it's a false narrative that is often told of these oftentimes big kind of tech corporations that you find in Silicon Valley. And oftentimes a story is told where there's a single visionary leader, right, that single-handedly founds this company, often in his garage somewhere, that ends up being a company like Amazon or Facebook or YouTube or whatever the case may be. But we know that that's a false narrative because with every single one of those stories in the founding of the company and especially in its development, you know that there's many, many hands that went into the success of that company. But oftentimes when we hear of stories of Christianity and in different seasons of its renewal and revival, often the same story is told. Of, big churches and ministries and big Christian movements and that kind of a thing. And when we tell of their stories, we love talking about a single visionary leader that almost single-handedly brought renewal and revival to a region, when it's most often true that it was more the likes of the numerous faithful men and women who were often there even before the single visionary leader came. And it was through their sacrificial giving, it was through their work that God was tilling the soil. And though oftentimes the singular leader gets the spotlight, we know that it is true that God works through his people to bring renewal and revival to a region. Now, as we get to the close of the letter of the book of Philippians, we now finally get to the practical reason for Paul's writing. And it's to express Paul's gratitude for the generosity of the Philippian church as they served as his patron, providing for his every need. And so what I want to do this morning is go over some biblical principles of generosity that is based on this text. Now, I think what we'll find in this text is that biblical generosity actually has far more to do with the heart than it ever has anything to do with the dollar amount, if you will. And it strikes at something that is far more satisfying and fulfilling than what you would normally associate with giving, and actually gets to the heart of what it means to build up a joy-inducing community. But even more so than that, if I want to add a little pressure to the text and what it can deliver, I would argue that it strikes at the heart of the Christian message itself. So I know it's a tall order to ask all of this from the text, but I think it's all right there in our passage this morning. So let me read for you Philippians chapter 4, verses 10 to 20. I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at length you have revived your concern for me. You were indeed concerned for me, but you had no opportunity. Not that I am speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Yet it was kind of you to share my trouble. And you Philippians yourselves know that in the beginning of the gospel, when I left Macedonia, no church entered into partnership with me in giving and receiving except you only. Even in Thessalonica, you sent me help for my needs once and again. Not that I seek the gift, but I seek the fruit that increases to your credit. I have received full payment and more. I am well supplied, having received from Epaphroditus the gifts you sent, a fragrant offering, a sacrifice acceptable and pleasing to God. And my God will supply every need of yours according to his riches in glory in Christ Jesus. To our God and Father, be glory forever and ever. Amen. This is God's word. Now, one of the things that struck me about this passage is Paul is very well aware of the fact that oftentimes in his missionary journeys and all of his church planting efforts, that he was often working in isolation. But he is one of the quickest to acknowledge the fact that he is not the lone journeyman. He is not the lone gunslinger. He is not the lone entrepreneur who is doing all of this work for God's kingdom. He is quick to understand that behind him and around him are a multitude of people that were giving generously and sacrificially. Now, we'll get into the biblical principles for generosity in a moment, but I want to highlight here, first and foremost, just how little Paul is interested in talking about finances. The only thing that we know is that he is well supplied. But the thing that he wants to strike at, the thing that he wants to mention the most is the heart behind the giving. And that's what we'll see time and time again as we talk about biblical generosity today. And so I want to look at this topic of generosity under three headings. First, what it looks like. Secondly, what it does. And lastly, where it comes from. All right, what it looks like, what it does, and where it comes from. So first, what does biblical generosity look like? Now, there are three kind of adjectives that I want to associate with what biblical generosity looks like, and that is committed, relational, and sacrificial. Right? Committed, relational, and sacrificial. Let me go through this fairly quickly here. Now, biblical generosity is committed. Now, if you were to look at verse 17 here, I want to say, verse 15. Paul says, you Philippians yourselves know that in the beginning of the gospel, until now you have been giving to me. That's what he's getting at. Now he's talking about the length of time. He's saying there's a familiarity and a shared history between you and me that was occasioned by your generosity, for which I am grateful for. And also, if you're to look at the rest of verses 15 to 16, he also talks about these times where in the beginning of the gospel, when I left Macedonia, he said, there was no other church that partnered with me except you only. And then he talks about another time in Thessalonica. Now, we know from the book of Acts that Paul in these places went through intense hardship and feelings of abandonment and isolation in these particular places, were really the only kind of support that he had and the only kind of friendship that he was able to experience was coming from the Philippians. And so Paul is saying, when every single person left me, when you yourselves could have said, maybe this is not worthy of our investment, this gospel thing, I'm not so sure if this burgeoning little sect of Judaism, as it was considered back in the day, was going to amount to anything. So why don't we pull back on our giving? Why don't we pull back on our relationship with him? Paul says, you all could have done that, and yet you stuck with me. You believed in me enough to care for me. Right, so biblical generosity is committing yourself over time and through the various circumstances to encourage and support one another. So biblical generosity is committed, but secondly, it's relational. Now, verse 10, Paul says, I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at length you have revived your concern for me. That you have revived your concern for me. Another way he words it is talking about entering into a partnership with me in giving and receiving. The words concern, partnership, giving and receiving, all of those words were words that convey deep friendship, right, in the ancient Greco-Roman world, right? Words that actually marked mutuality. And here's what's interesting. Paul's talking about a mutual relationship of giving and receiving. Now, we know that the Philippian church gave, but what did they receive? We know that Paul received help from the Philippian church, but what did he give? Now, here's what's interesting. The terms giving and receiving were never used of a patron-client relationship in the ancient Greco-Roman world. because there was patronage at the time, as it does today, right, with artists, right, wealthy kind of benefactors that commission artists to do their work and that kind of a thing. And that relationship existed back in the day, but it was almost always marked by hierarchy. The person that was doing the giving was oftentimes considered to be above that of the receiving party. So here, Paul, as he's using this language, what he's doing is this. He is flipping the conventional notions about a patron-client relationship, and he's leveling the playing field in the name of genuine friendship. So here's essentially what Paul is saying by using the words giving and receiving. For Paul, his heart was so tightly wrapped around the Philippian church that every single place he went, every single he did in gospel ministry, it was as if he was carrying the Philippian church with him. There was not a single place that he could turn to without thinking of this beloved church of his back in Philippi. And likewise, what Paul is emphasizing is this: in your giving to me, I know that you're in Philippi and I'm all the way over here in Rome, and as I was in Macedonia and Thessalonica, I know that I was physically away from you, but I know that your love and your concern and your care for me was such that your heart was so wrapped around me that wherever I went, whatever concerns I may have had, whatever difficulties that I may have come across, I know that you were right there with me in spirit. So here's what Paul is saying. Any work that I am doing on your behalf. And anything that I do, you can be assured that you are right there with me. It was as if they were working together in unison, even though they were geographically apart. So that's the second thing that we find, that biblical generosity is marked not just by financial giving, but in the giving and the receiving parties being knit together in their hearts in genuine and mutual friendship. And now that's what Paul is really interested in cultivating in our hearts as we think about being generous people. So it's committed, relational. Lastly, sacrificial. Now, you may have heard, if you're familiar at all with Christianity, or if you have had any proximity to the church over time, you may have heard of this kind of popular Christian maxim, right, that says, give until it hurts. Give until it hurts. Now, if you're anything like me and you can be kind of skeptical, you may say, are you just saying that so that, I give more money to the church? But here's what's interesting. What's interesting here is that Paul doesn't mention how much the Philippian church gave. He doesn't say, look at all this money that you gave me and here are all the things that I could do with it. Paul's really not interested in that. But Paul gets to the heart behind it. How does he do that? If you look at verse 14, Paul says, it was kind of you to share my trouble. Now, the word share is a hard word to describe, but the best way for me to describe it is to talk about being connected, right? Knit together, almost united to one another organically. Now, here's what Paul's saying. In their friendship, what Paul realizes that in the Philippian church's giving to him, it wasn't cultivating just this kind of friendship that consisted just of positive feelings that they had and saying, oh, what a wonderful friendship that we share with one another. But he realizes that the kind of friendship that was being cultivated by the Philippian church's generosity was one in which they were actually willing to enter into Paul's suffering. And so when Paul experienced abandonment, when Paul suffered, we know that he suffered intensely. Again, though they were not physically with him, it was as if the Philippian church were experiencing it with him all the same. And so here's what Paul is saying. You, Philippian church, you could have sat at home and say, we're good over here. And yet, even though out of sight, out of mind. Even though I was physically distant from you, even though all you could have done was just give me some money and, feel good about yourself, and I would have felt good in being supplied, you were willing to do far more than that. You were willing to enter into my suffering. to be concerned about me, to care for me, to pray for me, to be thinking about me, to want updates from me. So that any experience of suffering that I had, even though you were distant, you were willing to enter into it with me. That's the kind of generosity that Paul is talking about. Now, I mentioned three things here: being committed, relational, and sacrificial. Now, do you see how comprehensive biblical generosity is? And here's what this means. In a nutshell, to have a generous heart, now this can be towards a nonprofit, it can be towards the church, it can be towards any kind of cause that you want to support. But this is especially true as we interact with one another in community. To have a generous heart means having a heart that is willing to give yourself away for the sake of another. Right, remaining committed through their hardship, right, being invested in a relationship, a friendship with them, and to tie up your heart with them sacrificially. It's when you give of yourself in this way, the true power of generosity is unlocked. That's what biblical generosity looks like. Now, with that being said, having examined what generosity is, what happens when the power of this generosity is unlocked? What does biblical generosity do? So let's move on to the second point. Now, right there in the beginning of our passage here, verse 10, I want to repeat this verse again where Paul says, I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at length you have revived your concern for me. Here's the first thing that biblical generosity does. It leads to joy. Now, Paul says, at last you revived your concern for me. Now, that's borrowing kind of language from the botanical world, right? And so here's what Paul is saying. I know you were always concerned for me. I know you always cared for me. But you, unfortunately, up to this point, didn't get a chance to express your love and your care and your concern for me. But now that it has given the opportunity to bloom, just as flowers bloom, now that your generosity got a chance to bloom, I rejoice at the sight of it. But notice Paul says, I rejoice greatly. It's literally saying, I mega rejoice. Why? Because of your care for me. Now, Paul is having an honest and vulnerable moment here. We see later on in the verse, in the passage, that Paul has learned to be content in every circumstance. So he says, you can put me in the best place in the world, in the worst place in the world. I know that ultimately I'll be okay. But here, Paul is having an honest moment here where he recognizes that he isn't so hyper spiritual as to not be honest about the fact that, yeah, it's hard to be starving. It's hard to feel so lonely. It's hard to know that my life could end at any moment. And so when this provision comes, that's an expression of their mutual friendship and care for one another. It leads Paul to rejoice. Now, here's what I want you to see. Here's Paul, to many, a kind of historical figure. Now, whether you're a Christian or not, you have to admit this. Here is a singular historical figure who almost, in the eyes of many, who single-handedly changed the course of world history through his ministry work. And as he was facing down the devil and advancing the kingdom of the risen Jesus through his missionary work and his church planting, what gave him joy in the darkest hour? What gave him joy in the darkest hour? It was friendship. A friendship that is marked by the generous giving of one another for the sake of the other. My friends, here's what I want to see. If you want to see a gospel movement go forward, that's the key. It's not a gifted leader. It's not a ton of resources. It's people that are willing to come together to sacrificially give of one another for the sake of the other in supporting the work of the gospel ministry. As I said earlier, in the Western world, we love painting heroes. But I love the story of Lord of the Rings. Right? You know the story? Frodo has to bear this ring and bring it into Mordor with Sam. Yeah, that's right. He has to bring it into the heart of Mordor. I completely forgot the name. Right? He has to destroy the ring. And he thinks it's a lonely task. right? He is the singular ring bearer that has to go at it alone. But we see through his story, time and time again, he has to rely on his friends like Sam. Samwise the Gamgee. That's right. He has to continue to rely on his friends. Now, that's the gift of biblical generosity, to know that you don't have to go at it alone. So it leads to joy in knowing that I'm not in this alone. But secondly, it also leads to fruit. If you look at verse 17, Paul says, it's not that I seek the gift. He's literally saying this: I don't have my heart set on the gift that you're going to give me. But he says, but I do have my heart set on the fruit that increases to your credit. Now, when Paul says credit here, he's talking about, he's using accounting language. So he's basically saying this: every gift that you give to me is collecting for you interest that goes on into eternity. And here is speaking of a divine reward. Now, what Paul is saying is this: every gift that you give to me is going to count in some way towards this divine reward in the future. Now, oftentimes we think about this in individualistic terms, right? I'm going to somehow get an extra pat on the back by God at the end of time. And though we're certainly not far off from that truth, but here's what's more important for us to consider: is Paul here is painting a picture of how the Philippian church can be encouraged about that in the here and now. Because here's what is being highlighted for us here. The kind of credit that Paul is talking about is meant to serve as encouragement in the here and now. Here's what we know: that every single instance of your giving of yourself, whether it is financially, to a cause, whether it is to a church or a nonprofit, whether it is giving of your time towards this particularly difficult person that is going through a difficult season in their life, and they just need you to hear them out for hours and hours on end, and you're left wondering, like, where is this going? Am I doing any good for this person? In those times when you're wondering if your generosity is going to do anything, what Paul is saying is this: in the economy of the world, it may have been a waste of your time. You may have given to a nonprofit that didn't quite pan out, but in the economy of God, what you will find is that every instance of your giving is not just going to be remembered and you be commended for your generosity, but is bearing fruit that you can't yet imagine. There's an analogy that I love here that I heard of, where picture yourself as a stonemason. And you've been tasked by the great powers that be, by your employer, to work on a part of a glorious cathedral that is being built. And so you spend all your time in the yard, chiseling and shaping down stone blocks to make it as square and as perfect as possible. And you spend all of your days doing that, and you're frustrated. You're like, what is this even leading to? Right? It's such tedious work. And you are wondering, what is all of this going to amount to? But at the end of this construction work, you get to take part in the opening of the cathedral, if you will. And you look up and it is the most glorious work of architecture you have ever seen in your life. And you realize you've done something to contribute to it. Now, at the time, you had no idea where these stone blocks were going to go and how it was all going to fit together. But you realize it fits together more beautifully than you ever dared imagine. And what biblical generosity tells us is that your work in giving of yourself is going to be enhanced and ennobled far beyond what you could have imagined when you're grinding out in the stonemason's yard. What Paul is saying is this: no work of generosity will end up being a waste. Every dollar, every minute, every instance of your giving will be recognized by God, and He will build it into something far more glorious than you could have imagined for yourself. But lastly, quickly, it leads to the pleasure of God. Now, Paul considers the generous gift of the Philippian church to be an offering, a sacrificial offering that is pleasing to God. It's as if Paul is saying, when you're giving to me, it's as if you're giving to God. Now, for those of you, again, that are skeptical about whenever the church talks about giving, you can say, oh, you're just saying that, right? You give to God, so you better give to me. Well, Paul is actually striking here far more than a tactic for giving and receiving, but he's actually getting to the heart of the Christian God. Here's what Paul is saying. He is so secure in the love of God. He finds a God who is so in love with his people that to care for the needs of another actually brings pleasure to him. Think about your loved ones. Let's say your child goes to school and he comes back disrespected, disregarded, ignored. Your feelings are hurt. But think about it the other way around. Your teacher said, your child's teacher sends you an email and saying, "Oh, he or she is doing wonderful at school. It's such a pleasure to have him or her in my class." Your heart begins to sing. Right? That's the fatherly love of God that Paul is illustrating for us here. Now, this is what biblical generosity accomplishes, right? It forges deep friendships that causes joy in others, right? And leads to our joy of building up something that is beautiful and leading to the pleasure of God. But here's the question: how are we going to be generous, right? Because as great as this may sound, right, all of this comes at a cost. Right? It's always the cost of the one who is being generous, right? That's what Paul understands. The reason why he's so grateful is this: none of this, the Philippian church had to do. They could have sat back. But it is out of the sheer grace and the generosity of their hearts that Paul and the Philippian church were able to be united in this way. But it often comes at a cost. So how are we going to do this? So let's take a look at this last point. Where does biblical generosity come from? Now here's a quick word, right? If you want a heart of generosity that can spark a movement of renewal and revival, if you want that in your heart, it's not going to come by you white-knuckling your way through it and saying, I don't want to give, but here you go. No, that is not going to be powerful enough. If you want to have a generous heart, you need to learn to receive. If you want to learn to give, you better learn to receive first. Because ironically, to exhibit the kind of generosity with which the Philippian church gave, you actually need to learn from Paul. You look at verses 12 to 13. Now we get to one of the most famous verses and often misquoted verses in the entire Bible. Here's what Paul says: "I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me." I want to focus on that last part there. Paul says, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Now, how are you going to give yourself away without the kind of anxiety that asks, if I'm out of these resources, who's going to take care of me? If I spend all of my time, right, listening to this friend of mine who's going through a difficult season in their life, am I going to have any energy left for the other things that demand my priority, demand my attention in my life? Right, at the core of who we are, what keeps us generous is the fact that we are anxious. That if we were to give a part of ourselves away, that we would have nothing left. All of the stuff that we built up for ourselves, therefore we need to hoard it. Because who else is going to give us what we need? And this is what you need to know about God. You need to know that God is exceedingly generous. His heart's desire is to give to you. Not just the things that you ask for, but the things that you had no idea to ask for. What he wants for you is not just for you to have the necessities of life. He wants you to have an abundant life. Let me just read this. This week I came across an excerpt from an autobiography written by Matthew Perry. He's a very famous actor. Many of you may know him as Chandler Bing from the sitcom Friends. Many of you may also know that he's had many struggles offset, the details to which I won't go into here. And so he went through kind of very difficult times in his life when he was very, very sick. And I came across this excerpt And he recounts his time when he was waiting for an assistant that would come and deliver medication that would make him much better than he was at the moment. And he was feeling himself to be at rock bottom. Now, it's a lengthy excerpt, but here's what I want to encourage you. I don't read this kind of for its sensationalism. I don't read this to create some kind of an emotional affect on you necessarily. But as I read this excerpt together, and it's a very, almost a sacred moment in his life, I want you to enter into his life with me as we experience this moment together. So this is what he says: I hated myself. This was a new bottom. I didn't think you could get any lower than my previous bottom, but I had managed to do it. The front door still wasn't opening. This was serious trouble. I was a desperate man. As I sat there looking into the kitchen, I noticed a crinkle in the atmosphere. Now, perhaps someone not at their bottom might have waved it away as nothing, but to me, it was so compelling that I couldn't look away. It resembled a kind of a little wave in the air. I'd never seen anything like it before in my life. It was real, true, tangible, concrete. Is this what you see at the end? Was I dying? And then I frantically began to pray with the desperation of a drowning man. The last time I prayed, right before I'd gotten friends, I'd managed only to strike a Faustian bargain with a God who had simply drawn a long breath and bided his time. But here I was, more than a decade later, chancing my praying arm once again. God, please help me, I whispered. Show me that you are here. God, please help me. And as I prayed, the little wave in the air transformed into a small golden light. As I kneeled, the light slowly began to get bigger and bigger until it was so big that it encompassed the entire room. It was like I was standing on the sun. What was happening? And why was I starting to feel better? And why was I not terrified? The light engendered a feeling far more perfect than anything I had ever experienced before. Feeling euphoric now, I did get scared and tried to shake it off, but there was no shaking this off. It was way, way bigger than me. My only choice was to surrender to it, which was not hard because it felt so good. The euphoria had begun at the top of my head and slowly seeped down throughout my entire body. I must have sat there for 5, 6, 7, 8 minutes filled with it. My blood hadn't been replaced with warm honey. I was warm honey. And for the first time in my life, I was in the presence of love and acceptance and filled with an overwhelming feeling that everything was going to be okay. I knew now that my prayer had been answered. I was in the presence of God. I started to cry. I really started to cry. The shoulder shaking kind of uncontrollable weeping. I wasn't crying though, because I was sad. I was crying because for the first time in my life, I felt okay. I felt safe, taken care of. Decades of struggling with God and wrestling with life and sadness, all was being washed away like a river of pain gone into oblivion. I had been in the presence of God. I was certain of it. And this time I had prayed for the right thing. Help. Eventually the weeping subsided, but everything was different now. I could see color differently. Angles were of a different magnitude. The walls were stronger, the ceiling higher, the trees tapping on the windows more perfect than ever, their roots connected via the soil to the planet and back into me. One great connection created by an ever-loving God, and beyond a sky, which had before been theoretically infinite, was now unknowably endless. I was connected to the universe in a way I had never been, even the plants in my house, which I had never noticed before, seemed in sharp focus, more lovely than it was possible to me, more perfect, more alive. Now, I'm not here to litigate the nature of his salvation, nor am I here to uphold him as the next Christian hero to our godless popular culture. Rather, what I want to highlight here is the generosity of a God who was willing to meet with him when he hit rock bottom. Do you realize that it would have been more than enough for God to have spared his life at that moment? But as was indicated by the last paragraph, it wasn't enough that this generous God decided to come and spare this man's life, that God saw fit. It gave pleasure to God to come and not just spare him of his life, but to infuse him with new life, with life abundance. Friends, do you know that the greater your need for him, the more generous God will be with you? Do you realize the ways in which you and I, many of us have been trained to see God is a God who has his arms folded, who is waiting for you to perform, who is waiting for you to do all the right things, to push all the right buttons, for him to finally let go of some of the things that he had in store for you? Do you realize that you have been believing in a false God, an incomplete picture of a God who considers himself to be a generous father, far more generous than you and I, of those of us who are parents, could ever be? That you and I are looking for crumbs when he is preparing for us a feast. Friends, if you are going to be giving of yourself in any meaningful way that is going to make any difference in the world that is uniquely Christian, it's this: you need to understand grace. The fact that God is a generous Father who is just waiting for you to bring up your petitions to him so that he can surprise you with things that are far better than you could have imagined for yourself. That is the good news of the gospel. That is what drove Paul to spend his life for the sake of the gospel. And that's what drove the Philippian church to be generous with him. Friends, as we come together as a church, how are we going to make a difference in the world? It's by understanding the generosity of our Father, who gives and gives and gives until he makes generous people out of us. And friends, by the grace of Jesus and by the power of the Holy Spirit, may this be so. Let's pray.